beginning chapter 19 of Surprise Kill Vanish by Annie Jacobson. Operation Love Storm. George H.W. Bush had been out of the White House for less than 3 months when, in April 1993, he traveled to Kuwait on an official visit. He was there to receive the Mubarak, the Great Medal, the nation's highest civilian award for having pushed the Persian Gulf War resolution of 1991 through Congress, authorizing the use of U.S. military force against Iraq, then occupying Kuwait. The result had been Operation Desert Storm. This was a lavish celebration resplendent with swordsmen, drummers, and hundreds of cheering children waving flags. The Kuwaiti press called the 3-day affair Operation Love Storm. The Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Jabbar al-Ahmed al-Sabah, thanked the former president for the 541,000 U.S. military personnel who helped free Kuwait the year before. This award is in gratitude and appreciation for your enormous efforts in liberating Kuwait and your services toward world peace, said the Emir. George H.W. Bush responded in kind. Mere words cannot express how profound I feel to be here with you on the hallowed ground of Kuwait, he said. The Emir then knighted the former president and presented him with the Mubarak, the Great Medal, named for Kuwait's founder, who famously assassinated 2 of his half-brothers, political rivals, to ascend the throne. All went well during the festivities. The Emir neglected to mention to any U.S. official that a team of 16 assassins had tried to assassinate former President Bush with a powerful car bomb. Not for another 2 weeks would the Clinton White House learn about the alleged plot. Richard Clark, special assistant to the president, later wrote that he was the first person to hear about it. I was reading headlines from an Arab language newspaper, says Clark, when I saw a subject line that grabbed my eye. Sharq al-Awsat was reporting that a band of Iraqi assassins had tried to kill Bush when he was in Kuwait. There had been no such report from the Secret Service, FBI, CIA, or the embassy. Clark insists. Alarmed by this news, Clark telephoned the U.S. ambassador in Kuwait, Ryan Croker. Did Croker know anything about an attempted assassination on former President Bush? Clark asked. He had seen the article in Sharq al-Awsat. Had he seen the article in that Sharq al-Awsat? The ambassador said no, that this near attack was news to him. Clark then called Anthony Lake, President Clinton's national security advisor. Saddam tried to kill Bush, he said. The next morning, there was a sealed envelope on my desk, remembers Clark. A message so sensitive that it could not be sent to me electronically from the Situation Room. Clark learned that 17 men accused of being the assassins were presently being held in a Kuwaiti prison. The more the White House staff learned about the plot, the crazier it seemed to get. 2 of the prisoners, both Iraqi nationals, had implicated the Iraqi intelligence service, suggesting a conspiracy. Clark advised Anthony Lake to have the State Department put pressure on Kuwait to find out what exactly was going on. Why had the Kuwaitis told the newspaper about the conspiracy before they'd shared information with their friends in the United States? They have to come clean with us, Clark recalls Lake telling him. The fact that the Clinton White House was just now learning about the assassination attempt made the new president look weak. Ambassador Croker telephoned Kuwait's Minister of Defense. Details of the plot were not supplied at the time because President Bush was on his way home and the plot had been thwarted, the defense minister said. He told Croker that the government of Kuwait was moving forward with the trial. The White House demanded immediate access to all the prisoners. Because the attack was against a former U.S. president, the CIA and FBI had to be allowed to conduct their own independent criminal investigations, the White House said. On April 29, 1993, CIA officers from the Counter-Terrorist Center and FBI agents arrived in Kuwait City to interview suspects and examine evidence. From there, a narrative emerged. The group of assassins and accomplices included 4 Iraqis, 1 Kuwait-born Iraqi national, and 12 stateless Bedouins. The information the CIA found most credible came from the group's ringleader, a former military officer turned nurse, Wali al-Ghazali. The CIA accessed his records and learned he'd been trained to use explosives as a member of Iraqi's National Guard. In 1993, he was working at Al-Najaf Hospital outside Basra, he said when military intelligence service agents, the Mukhabarat, informed him he was being sent on a mission he could not refuse, to assassinate the former President Bush as revenge for the devastation caused by coalition forces during Operation Desert Storm. The Mukhabarat, also known as the Department of General Intelligence, was the most heavy-handed instrument of Iraq's state security system. With its multiple divisions, or directorates, the organization was fundamental to Saddam Hussein's preservation of autocratic rule. Like most Iraqi citizens, al-Ghazali knew better than to challenge a request. Fearing retribution against his family, he agreed to take part in the Mukhabarat's assassination operation. Taking advantage of the porous Kuwait-Iraq border, he was told to pose as a whiskey smuggler and infiltrate Kuwait with a car bomb. He was to park the vehicle on a busy Kuwait city street and then detonate the bomb remotely. As President Bush's motorcade drove by, the Mukhabarat provided al-Ghazali with a Land Cruiser pre-fitted with explosive devices that had been soldered into the side panels. He was giving 2 Browning pistols with suppressors, 2 landmines, 2 hand grenades, an AK-47, a passport from the UAE, a case of contraband whiskey, $1,100 in cash, and a suicide belt if the car bomb failed to detonate. Al-Ghazali was to walk to Kuwait University, get as close to President Bush as possible, and detonate the explosive belt as a Fedin, or suicide bomber. Directions understood. Wali al-Ghazali set off into the night, accompanied by the stateless Bedouins. Assassins crossed the border into Kuwait and drove the Land Cruiser to a pre-designated rendezvous point in a town called Al-Jada. There, they hid in a goat barn belonging to an uncle of one of the Bedouins. The men drank some of the whiskey they were given and fell asleep. When they awoke, the goat barn was surrounded by Kuwaiti police. Al-Ghazali said that he and 2 others escaped, stole a vehicle, and sped toward Iraq. But their car broke down, and they were forced to abandon it on the side of the road. As they walked into the desert, they were spotted by local bird hunters and reported and arrested by a Kuwaiti police patrol. It's impossible to know if the testimony was fabricated through coercion or a genuine account of an actual assassination plot. The declassified findings by the FBI forensics team were equally vague. The car bomb found in Kuwait closely resembles the corresponding components of Iraqi-made bombs that were recovered in February of 1991 during Operation Desert Storm, the report indicates, with details redacted. FBI agents warranted that the bomb's fusing system, faceplates, and radio-controlled receiving devices, as well as the type of circuit boards used, gave agents what they felt was a recognizable signature to a known Iraqi bomb maker affiliated with the Mukhabarat. The wires ran the on-off switch and were soldered to the circuit board in a uniquely expert way, proving that the same person was responsible. All pages rife with redactions, the FBI forensics team reached a conclusion. Examination of other components used in the explosive devices recovered in Kuwait, together with a comparison of the techniques used to assemble them once again, provided ample proof of direct Iraqi responsibility. Ample proof is hardly the same as beyond a reasonable doubt. But the trial was being held in Kuwait, not the United States. CIA officers with the CTC included Saddam Hussein's long history of assassinations and summary executions in its report for President Clinton. Since assuming power in the late 1970s, Saddam Hussein had ordered the killings of political rivals and people he felt had betrayed him. Religious clerics, Kurdish Peshmerga leaders, and scientists who attempted to defect had been shot, strangled, and blown up by the Mukhabarat. After the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein became the most emboldened with his plots. CTC officers wrote, exemplified in an assassination attempt against Danielle Mitterrand, the wife of the French president 9 months before. On July 6, 1992, Miss Mitterrand was traveling in a diplomatic convoy through the town of Sulaymaniyah, in northern Iraq. When parked, Toyota Land Cruiser exploded into a 60-foot high fireball. She escaped injury, but 4 members of her security detail were killed and 19 others wounded, mostly people who'd gathered to wave as she passed by. This brazen attack, wrote the CIA, demonstrated Saddam Hussein's willingness to disregard international opinion and possible military retaliation. There were other warning signs, wrote CTC analyst, including Ba'ath Party threats against President Bush shortly before the plot unfolded. Iraqi government officials hinted at a forthcoming attack. Bush will be killed based on a universal judicial system, Saddam's press secretary told a reporter for Al-Thawra, one that goes beyond the law of the jungle. Another Ba'ath Party official promised, this president will be cursed along with his ancestors until the day of judgment, that he and others would be hunted down and punished, held personally responsible for each drop of blood spilled on Iraqi soil. What to do? President Clinton called his advisors to the Oval Office. Secretary of State Warren Christopher said, a plot to kill a former president is an attack against our nation, President Clinton agreed. He ordered the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA to develop a target list. The list would include the headquarters building of the Mukhabarat. The strike should occur at night, the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, to minimize casualties. Colin Powell suggested cruise missiles launched from a destroyer in the Red Sea. On June 26, 1993, 23 Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched at Baghdad, leveling much of the Iraqi intelligence headquarters and killing a night watchman. 3 of the missiles missed their targets and exploded in a nearby residential neighborhood, killing 8 civilians. Among the dead were the director of Saddam Hussein's Center for the Arts, a painter named Leila al-Attar, her husband, and their housekeeper. The couple's son and daughter were both seriously injured. Al-Attar was reportedly a close friend of Saddam's. Her home had been hit by a missile in the Persian Gulf War, and she had suffered a serious wound to her leg. Now she was dead. In a nationally televised speech, President Clinton called the assassination plot against former President Bush particularly loathsome and cowardly, and revenge by a tyrant. But the U.S. response was not an attempt to kill Saddam Hussein, he said, rather a means to prevent future attacks. It was 2 days later that the 23 cruise missiles were fired. Madeleine Albright, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, citing Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, said that America was exercising its legal right to self-defense. In Baghdad, anti-American crowds held demonstrations in the streets. Revenge to America, they chanted. Shame on America. Glory to the martyrs of Iraq. They issued a warning to America's new president. Clinton, pay attention. We are the people who toppled Bush. It was the fall of 1993, and Lou Merletti sat at his desk inside the Treasury building, surrounded by piles of paperwork. He was no longer on the Presidential Protective Division on rare occasions, would stop to wonder how on earth he wound up in a place doing exactly the opposite of what he excelled at. For more than a decade, he had been in the president's inner circle. Now he was being asked to serve as a bureaucrat. It was the job I was assigned to do, and I accepted that. But it was really depressing, Merletti recalls. He felt like Billy Waugh did when he was working at the post office after Vietnam. Everything had been going well back in 1992. As the assistant to the special agent in charge of the president during the Gulf War, Merletti had been entrusted with tremendous responsibility. When President Bush and General Schwarzkopf traveled to the Middle East during Operation Desert Storm, Merletti was in charge of their security. Because of his combat experiences as a Green Beret in Vietnam, he felt entirely confident in the role. His missions had all been a success, and now, 20 months later, here he was sitting at a desk, loaded down by paperwork. Prior to the presidential election of 1992, Merletti was selected by the Secret Service to assume the top position in the Presidential Protective Division, where George H.W. Bush to be reelected. When Bill Clinton won the election instead, Merletti was assigned to the Treasury Department, the organization that governed the U.S. Secret Service. At Treasury, he had been asked to lead the team investigating what went wrong in Waco, Texas, when federal agents raided the compound of a religious cult suspected of stockpiling illegal weapons, and 76 people died. The fiasco would become known as the Waco Siege. Merletti's official title summed up the labyrinthine world into which he'd been pulled. He was the deputy director of the review team for the report of the Department of the Treasury on the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms investigation of Vernon Whale Howell, also known as David Koresh. The work was laborious and painstaking. It was not pleasant investigating where fellow civil servants' work went wrong. Because the investigation was such a high-profile event, as the top law enforcement officer on the team, Merletti was unwittingly shoved into the limelight. When it came time to report the findings to Congress, his situation went from bad to worse. The Treasury Department's top law enforcement officer had told federal firearms administrators that a probe into their February 28th raid uncovered serious errors in agents' judgment, and that some officials had knowingly made misleading statements about the raid to their superiors and the media, reported the Washington Post. People lost their jobs, Merletti explains. Then a very strange thing happened. At the congressional hearing, under oath, a congressman said to me, "I'd like to meet the individual who was in charge of this report," Merletti recalls. The initial tone of the congressman, a fellow Republican, at first led Merletti to believe that he was experiencing appreciation for the youth, for the truth. Most Republicans seemed to want blame laid at the feet of President Clinton, which the Treasury report had determined should not happen. "I wrote the report," Merletti told the congressman. He looked at me, recalls Merletti, and his tone switched. He said, "I just had to meet you in person. Who wrote this pack of lies?" Merletti was stunned. "So you're a Clinton guy," the congressman said, smirking. In that moment, Merletti understood. It was all politics. As a service agent, Lou Merletti was trained to leave politics out of the job. "The office of the president is what matters," he explains. "There is an institution to uphold. We used to have a sign on the wall in the White House field office that said, 'You elect him, we'll protect him.' We all worked with that concept in mind." That Merletti was no longer on the Presidential Protective Division had nothing to do with politics, he told himself. It had to do with circumstance. He reported the Waco failings he discovered because it was the truth, not because he was a Democrat, which he wasn't. Several days later, he received word that President Clinton wanted to see him in the Oval Office. "I went into his office," Merletti recalls. "I was told to bring a copy of the report. The president gave me a compliment regarding the work. He pointed to the report and asked to autograph it for me." There was a long pause, Merletti recalls. Then the president spoke candidly. He said something to the effect of, "You did a good job up there," meaning on Capitol Hill, he said. That he and his staff knew the investigation was going to be politicized, and they were aware that I probably had no idea my testimony was going to be about that. The president was thanking Lou Merletti for being apolitical. The meeting was over, and Merletti went home to his family. Perhaps Clinton said something to the director of the Secret Service, or to the special agent in charge of the Presidential Protective Division, or maybe what happened next was circumstantial. Either way, Merletti's life was about to change. On September 12, 1994, 70 miles north of the White House near Aberdeen, Maryland, an unemployed truck driver named Frank Eugene Corder spent the evening with his brother, drinking alcohol and smoking crack cocaine. Around midnight, Corder asked his brother to drop him off near a small airport in Churchville. Once there, Corder somehow managed to scale the fence, drop down onto the tarmac, and steal a Cessna aircraft. High on drugs, he taxied down the runway and took off into the night sky. Corder was not a licensed pilot, but had taken a few Cessna lessons the summer before, apparently learning enough to allow him to fly the stolen aircraft over Pennsylvania and Maryland for roughly 40 minutes. At 1:06 a.m., FAA radar systems at Baltimore Washington International Airport detected the aircraft and noted that it was 6.5 miles north of the White House, flying at an altitude of 2,700 feet. The plane dropped by 1,000 feet, turned around, and headed south. At 1:48 a.m., it entered the prohibited airspace of the White House complex and began descending rapidly. With its wing flaps up and its throttle position in full forward. Corder crashed the Cessna into the lawn, skidded across the grass, struck a magnolia tree, and slammed into the first floor of the White House, killing himself. President Clinton and his family were across Pennsylvania Avenue at Blair House for the night. It was a calamitous security breach, made worse by an interview the Secret Service gave to Newsweek magazine. National airports shut down at 11 p.m., and controllers in the tower were absorbed in other duties. An official spokesman said, when the reporter asked how was that even possible, why the FAA hadn't detected the security breach, the official said, "The FAA isn't really in the business of protecting the president from flying suicides." To which the Newsweek reporter responded, "That leaves the real question, who is?" The entire event was a disaster. To Lou Merletti's eyes, the presidential protection was contingent on three fundamentals that never changed. The world is a dangerous place. It doesn't matter who's to blame. Only that you defend against it. The U.S. Secret Service must never appear weak. An attack could come from anywhere, including a lone wolf, a terrorist organization, or a foreign government. Because Merletti had foreseen this kind of attack from above, the Presidential Protective Division had trained for it during the Delta Force Halo Assassin Attack on Principle exercise. He was called to the White House. Secret Service Director L.J.B. Bowron asked him how security could be tightened. These details, like all Secret Service protocols, are classified. Bowron also asked Merletti to come to the Secret Service team room in the White House to talk to the PPD agents about what it meant to protect the president. The speech is classified. But Lou Merletti says he wrote it with his old friend, Mike Krupas, in mind. Bowron transferred Merletti back to the White House PPD. He would now serve as Deputy Special Agent in charge, which meant he was the number 2 in charge of safety and security of the President of the United States. In the middle of October, President Clinton called Lou Merletti into his office to tell him to prepare to travel to Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel. This was one of the most difficult and dangerous parts of the world in which to protect the President of the United States against assassination attempts. Lou Merletti was ready for the job. Yeah, that is it for Chapter 19.